look up repowering in the Article 10 statute. So.
See if there's anything we can learn. Okay, good afternoon. Sorry for the slight delay. Lots of familiar faces are getting used to sitting around this table. Today we're going to be talking about repowering as part of staff's ongoing consideration. Yes, of related issues. There we go. Just bring it closer to my mouth. But before we get into the substance, why don't we go around the table and just ask you to introduce yourself for people who may be watching on the video cast, and then we can make fun of the people who are later not showing up.
Hi, Doreen Harris with NYSERDA.
Amanda DeVito Trenzi for the City of New York, and I don't think Mr. Mayor is going to be here today.
Take down his tent. There he goes.
Ann Reynolds with the Alliance for Clean Energy of New York.
Frank Murray for NRDC.
Jim B. Shelby, Engineering Corporation. We own and operate hydroelectric facility.
John Todd, NYSEG Gardini. Pat Fox, NYSEG Gardini.
Margaret Jansen from National Grid.
Chris Rout for Con Edison.
Tom Rienzo, DPS staff.
Warren Myers, DPS staff.
Tina Palmero, DPS staff.
And I'm Scott Wiener, DPS staff. So I want to thank everybody for coming. We're going to make up some time on the agenda now. We're up to item number 2, which is background and overview of repowering. And Doreen is going to provide us, right?
Yeah.
With insightful background and perceptive overviews.
Thank you, Scott. Let me see if I can start. Oops. There. So just to provide some background on repowering and the Clean Energy Standard, we thought we'd go through the proceeding as it is existing today and ending with this meeting and the dialogue that will ensue. So this concept of repowering and associated eligibility for the Renewable Energy Standard was really the subject of the Phase 1 implementation plan, which was filed jointly by NYSERDA and the Department of Public Service in October of last year. And from NYSERDA's perspective, we saw this filing as being very helpful in implementing the Clean Energy Standard in the sense that to the extent that we could have very clear rules with regard to eligibility, it would be helpful as we move forward. Projects in New York are becoming more complex as time goes on. And through the administration of the RPS, we saw the fact that some of these issues had become a little bit gray with regard to eligibility. And the Phase 1 implementation plan served to provide clarity, at least from a proposal perspective, with regard to eligibility issues for what we saw as more complicated undertakings than simply some of the resource eligibility questions, which were the subject of the August order. So the Phase 1 implementation plan covered a number of items, but the focus today is with regard to eligibility, and specifically the eligibility of repowered facilities. And so the implementation plan proposal really used a term called vintage generation facilities, which were those that were in commercial operation before January 1st, 2015. And that's the threshold eligibility date for the Clean Energy Standard. And this is really regarding eligibility for Tier 1, which is the growth tier or the new tier for the Clean Energy Standard as it was adopted. However, these vintage generation facilities, we saw a variety of circumstances through which they could become eligible for Tier 1. And just to review those very briefly, the first is through an upgrade. And this is very similar to that which was employed under the old RPS main tier, with the exception of the fact that there was now specificity with regard to the proposal regarding the number of years that a baseline would have to exist prior to an upgrade occurring, as well as the conditions upon which the upgrade would be eligible, most notably the extent of capital investment that would be required. In addition, the amount of additional energy output that would be needed to qualify that upgrade for Tier 1 status. We also looked at eligibility from a return to service perspective. That is a facility that had actually ceased operation and sought to re-enter operation as a Tier 1 facility. The proposal was a 48-month window of lack of operation on the part of the facility for its return to service for eligibility for Tier 1. And the eligibility for repowering was, again, the subject of today's meeting. We looked in quite a bit of detail with regard to eligibility for repowered facility using two primary terms. The first being the prime mover, that is the, I'll call it the primary use equipment, if you will, that causes generation to occur at the facility. And also the useful life of the facility, that is, how long should it operate before it moves into a different status. So we proposed 5 different criteria for eligibility for repowering. The first, that the prime mover had operated for the length of its useful life. The second, that the prime mover had been replaced with a new one, which had the proper vintage date for Tier 1. We also proposed that the prime mover upgrade result in a material increase in output for eligibility to occur, 15% in the proposal. That the repowered facility was at the site of the original generation facility. And also that 80% of the tax basis per gap from the repowered facility was derived from capital expenditures made on or after January 1st of 2015. Just to go through on a high level, the definitions of prime mover. This is listed by energy source, copied directly from the implementation plan proposal. For most projects, it would be either the engine or the turbine, or in the case of solar, the modules and inverters associated with the facility. And then the definition of useful life, copied here directly from the proposal, varied by technology type, but matched the same criteria that NYSERDA had been using in its previous proposals, or RFPs. We use this same term to define the length of contract that a facility is eligible for in our solicitations. The fourth category of these types of resources had to do with relocated facilities, and these are those that move from a location outside of both the New York control area and adjacent control areas into the New York, into either one of those areas, and the requirements associated with eligibility for that prime mover and the associated generation facility. Again, this October filing was a proposal which was subject to extensive public comment. In fact, 20 parties submitted comments in response to that proposal, ultimately leading to a Public Service Commission order in February of this year. The order defined certain changes to the rules that had been proposed in the initial implementation plan. I'll review those briefly in a second. But ultimately, those changes were reflected in a final implementation plan that NYSERDA and DPS filed in March of this year. So that is available both in the case order as well as on NYSERDA's website for those that want to view the differences between the initial proposal and the final plan. The final, the comments, again, ran the gamut from parties who were interested in various changes to eligibility rules, kind of the details with regard to the numbers that we had proposed for both the percentages as well as the useful life and the like. And I'm sure those will be the subject of today's discussion as well. In addition, there were comments that were received around the need for these facilities to be eligible, particularly with regard to repowered facilities, as well as those comments really centered around the idea of whether it was equitable to be paying for facilities that were repowered that perhaps had been funded in some other means previously by the state. However, in the final implementation plan, which was reflective of the order that the Commission issued, there were a few changes that were made in response to those comments. The first is that the baseline period NYSERDA will be utilizing is able to be a longer 10-year baseline period. This was a primary comment of the hydroelectric facility representatives. We also saw that a upgrade to a specific unit was eligible for eligibility for Tier 1 should it result in an overall output increase of 5% at a minimum. And also there was a question about the time period that needed to pass before the payments could commence, and the commission clarified that that did not need to require an entire year to pass for eligibility to ensue in payments. However, with regard to the topic of discussion today, the commission order did not allow repowered facilities to be eligible for Tier 1 at this time, and instead required the staff in a filing that was to be due 180 days after the order to really integrate considerations of repowering as part of other considerations that are all kind of wrapped in to one larger deliberation regarding baseline resources, the support of those baseline resources, eligibility for Tier 2, any rules that may be appropriate to change with regard to how it had been adopted in the original order, really recognizing that it was worthy of renewed consideration before the first triennial review by the commission. So that filing is, again, within 180 days of the order issuance, which will be later this summer. And specific today is the discussion about repowering. So with that, I will turn it back to Scott to begin our roundtable discussion. Hopefully that provided a useful background for those who needed a refresher on eligibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. Again, today is intended to really help us on staff understand the depth and breadth of this issue and your perspectives about it, all in furtherance of our work to prepare the report, which I guess is due on September 9th.
Actually, it's August 22nd.
It's August 22nd. There you go. I had VDR in my mind.
Right.
So I just lost 3 weeks of my life. August 22nd. We have the agenda. We have a small group today, and usually a small group for these roundtable discussions. So I want to try and keep it flexible and not be too rigid. And there are 6 or 7 topics that we've included, which seems to be the topics that principally come up when we enter into a discussion about repowering. And rather than try to stick with this rigid group, what I want to do, given the relatively small size today, is start by going around the table and invite you to talk about or just highlight the issue or two that, or 3 or 7. If you want to hit all of them that you're most concerned about, then we'll come back and we'll begin to have a discussion about them in some order. And for those of you who are in the room who might want to ask questions, we're scheduled to end around 4:15. Before that, we'll allow time for any questions that we can entertain either from people in the audience or people who may be watching remotely. And for people who are watching remotely, they can send in questions by ces@dps.ny.gov. Okay, Amanda.
Hello. So I think from the city's perspective in being here today, we're kind of here to get some more information from the group and understand really what technology types repowering realistically pertains to at this point in time. Are we looking at, older hydro facilities, or are there other types of renewables that realistically this would apply to in the near term future? We're not really sure. The city supports renewables. The city supports repowering, especially within the city when we're talking about fossil fuel units. But we're really here to hear today to listen and see what other folks have to say and information that it might be presented.
Thank you. Ann?
So just on behalf of ACE, of course, we represent companies that have existing renewables that may or may not be interested in repowering them, as well as those developing new renewables. When the proposal came out in the Phase 1 implementation plan, we supported that proposal to, with the conditions that were there, to have these facilities be eligible for Tier 1 should they make that major investment to get repowered. I just two things to add. I think the overarching goal, as we're considering those criteria, should be, can we maximize the renewable energy generation at the facilities that we have most cost effectively, especially if it's more cost effective than building new renewables in new locations. And then also to just agree that it is very linked to what happens with Tier 2 and what happens with compensation for existing renewables. So your question, Amanda, is hard to answer. I think that it's largely hydro. It could, in the relatively near future, be wind. There are larger turbines. There's turbines that, so you could be able to create more electricity at the site that you have delivered already. But I think whether that's likely or whether it happens depends on the combination of what's decided for repowering and what's decided for Tier 2.
Thank you, Frank.
Scott, the environmental community, NRDC in particular, we didn't file any comments on repowering. So a kind of an open book and an open mind in a lot of this, so to speak. I mean, I'm generally, not surprisingly, sympathetic to what Ann just articulated, namely, I don't see any reason why I would not be supportive of trying to maximize the output of existing facilities and making them eligible under Tier 1. I do have a concern, and Ann kind of touched upon it with regard to Tier 2 and the relationship between Tier 2 and repowering. And I'm sure it's probably something you've already thought about, but depending upon how you work out Tier 2, I can conceive of a situation where a developer may decide to, in effect, shut down its plan for eligibility under Tier 2 and have it sit there for a while in order then to qualify for the repowering Tier 1, depending upon what sort of criteria and eligibility you put in place. And whether that's a public policy good or bad, I don't really know. We're looking, I think, as you are, to get as much incremental new generation from renewables to achieve the governor's articulated target. And in that respect, I did have one question, particularly for the NYSERDA folks, whether you have any sense as to kind of what the universe of potential projects are for repowering. We're talking about something that's actually yet to be seen or imagined, a fairly small piece of the puzzle, or are we thinking it's something that you think potentially could be a lot bigger down the road?
Thanks, Frank. From our perspective, this is primarily an issue that impacts hydroelectric facilities, and Jim will chime in, I'm sure, next. But it impacts small existing baseline hydro facilities in the sense that many of them have fairly significant financial need at the moment and fairly significant capital improvements that need to be made to really continue operating for an extended period of time. So, I would say from a generation perspective, this isn't a massive impact, but these are facilities that over time will mount in their number. And as Ann indicates, our existing wind fleet is, a number of them are approaching 10 years of operation. And as they begin to head into the teens and into the 20s, it'll become an issue at those facilities as well.
The only thing I'll add,
Pete.
I think I saw an article recently.
Microphone.
No.
The green light should be lit.
Sorry. I believe a repowered, let's say a wind turbine, where we have seen in the last several years increasing capacity factor about 10% or so, I think, from the original technologies under the RPS. Are those turbines eligible for some sort of federal PTC or federal credits? I believe so currently. Now, what the future holds for that sort of, financial opportunity, I don't know. But that is an article I read recently suggesting should go quicker rather than slower, because that opportunity, the opinion of the article was, yeah, they're eligible for the PTC or the ITC, whatever, as for those capital costs.
Oh, I was with Frank up to the point where he said that some of us might shut our turbines down for 4 years. I don't think I don't think that's going to happen for most of us. We have a fairly narrow focus, and that's hydro. I don't think there's going to be such a groundswell of folks coming in to repower at current rates, either the market rates or even the expected RPS rates. There will be some, and we're certainly among them. I think in general the conditions are reasonable. With one exception. I think it's being made a little more complicated than it needs to be. We're regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission extensively. So rather than putting energy increases, I would simply put a capacity number in. I mean, all of these projects are subject to going in for an amendment on their license, their hydropower license by the feds, if we don't already have one. And determining whether it's 5% more energy or 10% or really simply just a 15 or 10% increase in capacity, nameplate capacity, would be a simpler approach to it. I think all these projects, can get that kind of a capacity increase, which will translate to energy. I would just make it simpler rather than more complicated. These projects, there's a lot of them. There could be 100 of them. But I think most of them are not going to be going for repowering in the near future just because of the rates. Some will.
Emmett.
Thanks. I would echo Jim's comments on the potential scale. I also want to agree that there are a lot of small hydro plants that need some capital reinvestment. One of my primary concerns about the implementation plan as it's written is the focus on the prime mover. The turbine is not always the thing that needs reinvestment. To me, it seems like any of the critical elements of the plant that allow it to continue to live should be eligible for repowering, such as the dam. Also, the prime mover, the turbine, is not necessarily always the wisest choice to replace it with new. Many of these facilities that were PURPA facilities were old machinery that was gotten going again. They're extremely long-lived. The turbines can last. Ours are 100 years old, and they're running very, very well. If we were to replace them, it's possible there'd be an incremental gain in output, but we would also have to replace the generators because they're matched units that are site-specific. And the PURPA experience has shown that a lot of the plants that repowered with new equipment in the 80s and 90s have had much more trouble in the last 30 years than the older machines.
Thank you.
So, thanks.
John?
Yes, I think overall, the repowering area is something that we need to make clear what the rules are for developers and also what's fair and equitable to ratepayers who've been paying developers for projects from the beginning back in the RPS. I'm less concerned about predicting how many people actually participate as opposed to getting the rules out there that are consistent. So when the market conditions change, you know what the rules are. But I also think that if you look at the RPS, the first contracts that were done, Peter, we've seen some of the contracts came off. The maximum term was 10 years. So I do think we want to assess basically for any type of technology, is it better to repower? That there's a potential contract here in New York? Or I'm not going to sit idle for X number of years. I'm going to go to New England, sell the RECs over there, and maximize my portfolio. So I think it's important to get consistent rules out there for the developer to assess what the options are, and for us here in New York to try to maintain the resources that ratepayers have actually provided assistance to, that they stay here in New York. They may not all stay. But I also think that the issue is broader than just wind and hydro, and I think we're seeing amazing technology improvements in solar, although solar is relatively new. And we're starting to see projects that are almost 20 megawatts in size. That's significant. I also think, landfill generators, they don't get a lot of press, but basically, landfills have been growing here in New York State. And the life term is only 15 years for those projects. But the reality is they can easily do a capital investment on those reciprocating machines, and they're running. So I think, what's the signal to that landfill developer up in the Syracuse area in terms of can they do a repowering? I think Tier 2 is the home for this, I think the challenge for us is try to work out how we get that fit, consistent rules for the developer, and also fair and equitable to ratepayers.
No comment from NYSEG RG&E. It was just shared.
Okay.
Interject one thing. I think the tier 2 is, I think Frank mentioned as well, is significant. How that relates to tier 1 is very significant, and I'm not quite sure of the interplay, but it also relates to New England, to export. And so sitting here today, we're looking at all those opportunities, and there's an equation between the tier 1 repowering and continuing to operate with tier 2. In some cases, we have to repower because we're under federal license, under mandate, but there is an interplay there.
National Grid is supportive of keeping our units online that to contribute to the state's goals, and as echoed by others, that doing this in a cost-effective manner is important to us and to our customers, particularly for those units that have received support from the state. And our thought is that if the cost effectiveness can be demonstrated, it seemed fair and equitable that the incremental output of the facility that's been repowered, that would be clearly something that's adding to the state's goals and something that would lend itself to the tier 1. And any other consideration would have to go through a thorough, cost-effective review just to make sure to determine whether it's better to make the investment in a new resource versus repowering of an older one.
Hi, Chris Rapp from Con Edison. So, agree with the wise comments of my utility colleagues. And I think our overall concern with the repowering option as it showed up in the implementation proposal was it seemed like it was kind of being handled maybe separately from other considerations. So, how to keep existing resources that are under financial duress, how to keep those operating, and how best to bring on new incremental resources. And kind of going back to Ann's point about optimization, I think our interest is not necessarily in optimizing production at individual facilities, but optimizing the cost at which we achieved the 50 by 30 goal. And so that's why we, I think, expressed some concern in our comments about the individual repowering proposal when we hadn't necessarily figured out what we're going to do with the existing resources under the maintenance type structure. In addition, there were some options that were discussed during the CES proceeding, which we decided not to pursue. One of them was utility ownership of generation, and one of the reasons that we thought that option was important is because we saw like the residual value of facilities and locations as being significant, and that we wanted to, as much as possible, capture those residual values for customers who had paid for those resources.
So how does that cut?
How does that work?
In other words, if you want to retain the resource for the customers that paid for it, how does that goal manifest itself when we think about this issue?
So I think what I would look at is, that we have the prime mover is one aspect of the facility, but there are other aspects as well. So there can be significant, local infrastructure upgrades, substations that are built to carry the power back to the bulk power transmission system. And what would be wrong to us is, new facilities that were supported by customers in the beginning, including those substations. If a repowered project came back and said, we want to get paid tier 1 RECs, and we would like to bid that into the tier 1 REC solicitations and be able to get paid as bid. Our view would be the existing resources that don't need to be replaced, so like those substations that are working perfectly well, we don't want our customers paying twice for things that they've already paid once for. And we think utility ownership is one way to avoid those types of situations, but there are probably other ways as well. So.
I'm sure there are. And we'll explore them all. Anybody on staff or I sort of want to make any observations to start.
Say one thing in terms of cost effectiveness. The contemplation is that they would compete. So if they were deemed eligible for a tier 1 contract, they'd have to compete with others for it. So, and I this is a complicated situation. I'm not suggesting it's not, but that's one of the ways that we've been going at cost effectiveness from the beginning. Is you build as robust a competitive pool as you can, and let the market sort of hopefully bring prices down as far as they can go.
Right. And we respect the notion that competition should bring down costs, and it should, but you shouldn't be able to compete with stuff that customers fully paid for already. So using the example of that substation that's next to the wind turbines, you shouldn't be able to take that substation that maybe was paid for in that first RPS contract and bid that cost along with the cost of your repowering into a new solicitation. To us, that doesn't seem like a great example of competition.
Can I ask a question about that one? The point you made was exactly what I was going to ask, if I could ask a question without reflecting a position of ACE. But if the fact that the repowered facility has to compete with the other tier 1 resources is enough to say that it's cost effective, is the first part of the question.
Let me interject for a second. I think we may be glossing over another step in the analysis. So, as I think of, and one of the questions I was going to ask is to talk about cost effectiveness, because I think it manifests itself in two places. The first is, does anybody here want to make the argument, maybe not, we'll have a really short afternoon, of that a repowered facility should be able to bid in its entire capacity, not just the incremental capacity?
Isn't that the proposal?
The entire capacity, correct, because we already have a standard for upgrades, right? In the tier 1 or in the phase 1 implementation plan, we have a criteria for upgrades that where anything above a historic baseline can bid into the tier 1 rec auctions, and if they are chosen, they will receive tier 1 recs for the full output of that increment. Mm-hmm. So that's already settled. The commission has approved that. So what we're talking about is repowering an existing facility and having the entire output be eligible for recs. It's not just the upgrades.
Right. So in thinking about, and I think maybe Jim or Emmett, the owner of a facility looks at this current situation and says, I want to improve my economics. I need to improve my economics, for whatever the reasons might be. And those reasons, of course, have an important import. There are a couple different pathways that are available. You can get a tier 2 maintenance contract, you can do an upgrade, and potentially a repowering. And at some point, the expectations of ratepayers who have paid for that come into play. It's those, and that's part of the tier 2 maintenance issue. It's part of the issue here.
But just to answer Ann's question directly, and the step that's missing to guarantee to our ratepayers that it is most cost effective is whether the payment is necessary at all to get the output from the existing facility. You've heard allusions to, well, we're going to have to repower it anyway. And this all goes back to the same approach that we've taken to things like flex retail rates, where a company threatens to leave the state or leave the service territory if they don't get a better rate than all the other customers. We know we price above marginal costs, so there is some price below the cost we need to set to recover all of embedded costs. We could, for certain customers that really are going to leave, but if we could retain them for something above marginal cost, it makes everybody better off. That same but if we lowered the rates to everybody and shifted cost to all of the cost for one service class to all other customers, that's much more expensive than it needs to be to retain that one customer. Well, that same logic has been applied to the maintenance tier. Same logic has been applied to evaluating energy efficiency. You don't want, you account for an estimated free rider proportion. So in a world where we don't have universal carbon prices leading to long-run efficient economic payments for externalities, the state finds itself in a position of how can we achieve our goals as economically as we can. And one of the approaches we've taken is let's be careful that we don't pay for, the extreme example are NIPA resources. Despite what someone at NIPA might want to argue in the long run, they seem to be doing okay. They don't seem to need our rec payments to continue to produce at Niagara and St. Lawrence. So they clearly were excluded from the original RPS. Well, the same mentality went to maintenance tier. And that same approach could be applied to repowering. Now, there are economic arguments back that say, well, in the long run, it would be much better to have a universal carbon price, et cetera, pay everybody and stop trying to discriminate between free riders and non-free riders. And that's all well and good, but we're living in Trump world. We're not moving towards the more likelihood of universal. Yeah, right. Well, we can deny it. But so we have New York facing what is the cheapest way to do what we want to do, given that we still have Pennsylvania not, what's the cheapest way? What's the most economic way to achieve our goals? And so that's the logic we've applied. We've had that two-part thing. Yes, it would get it for the cheapest price if we allowed it to compete with everyone else. But the question is, do we even have to allow it to this one particular facility to compete to get its output?
At the same time, someone else made a reference, I think, John, about the importance of clear rules, eligibility rules, so that the market can see those in advance. They can plan. We'll echo that 100 times. I mean, the thing we least like to do it, and I sort of is interpret a rule to facts. We're much better off, as is everyone else, if we can just apply the facts and have an answer appear. It's funny, the situations you can see. Things get complex, and they have over the last 10 to 12 years. Take a situation where I've built a wind farm on a site, got a 10-year rec contract. For whatever reason, the owner of the site goes out of business, the decommissioning fund kicks in, they're taken away, they're gone. More likely in a different sort of a technology, but if you can follow me. Is that site now disqualified for any future rec contract? Was it the project or is it the site? Because sometimes what we arrive at, it's the site, which I'm not sure that makes a whole lot of sense. For to say a geographic spot, with GPS coordinates, is no longer eligible for a rec contract because there was a project there. Things change over time. I mean, there was discussion in the past, and I think it was.
But don't leave that. So let me change the fact that rather than an owner decommission their plant, taking it away, and the owner moving to Florida, the owner decommissions the plant, sends it away, and then comes in to build a new plant. Do we care? Are there any circumstances under which we would say that there is a commonality of interest that should be noted?
In that particular example, would the 5-year thing apply?
So the way the rules would work today is the only thing that would be eligible, unless the facility was offline for the period of time that was required for a return to service facility, is the only thing that would be eligible in that circumstance is the increment above what the facility had historically produced. And I would think, based on the comments that had been received, that in what we see in practicality is that does not often provide the economics needed to actually make the investment to bring that plant back into not only operation but also enhanced operation through the investments that would be made by the current owner. Mm-hmm. And so we see a lot of projects that expect that they may have eligibility beyond that which they actually do right now, because of the fact that these upgrades get confused with repowerings pretty regularly on the part of the diverse development community here in New York.
Okay. I mean, I guess, Scott, I interpret your question to be the same one you asked before. Like, is there anyone here who wants to argue that when you do a repowering and meet those criteria, the whole thing should count for Tier 1, not just the increment? In a way, because that's what it would be. They take the turbines to Florida, they put in new ones that would meet the proposal. Should we still call this the proposal? Let's just, for the sake, I think that it should count, and I hear Warren's argument. I think, our position is on Tier 2 is different too. It's that there should be compensation for all those resources. But putting that aside for the moment, this is different because you're attracting new investment to New York, which is a good thing, and you are, under your own criteria, you're doing it at a facility that has reached its end of life. So there's other questions about what if the turbines fail, but I think those two elements of it make it different, and then that project competes with other new Tier 1 resources, so that's how you argue that it's cost effective, and you're getting what you need to do to meet your Tier 1 obligations to get to 50% cheaper because you're doing it from repowering.
I heard the question, and maybe I wasn't clear, maybe I'm misunderstanding, which is probably more likely the case. So if a new facility meets the criteria that is stated, it would be considered repowering, and it would be eligible to bid in. What I thought Peter was exploring on the question of site or machine is a situation where one is an owner that just decides that the time has come to close this up, and for whatever reason decides not to build again, sends off their equipment, sends off the scrapyard, and moves out of state and retires, both the machine and the individual. And somebody else buys the piece of property and wants to put in a new machine. And we'd say that's new, I think. Okay, but now I'm saying is what happens if it's the same owner and he just says, I'm shutting down, and sends it all off, doesn't wait 48 months, and comes back.
Aren't both of those things fitting the proposed definition of repowering?
No.
One is a return to service. The 48 months is a
not those two. I mean,
so if I have a machine,
the owner goes to Florida and goes away, and someone else new comes along, it actually would be repowering, not new, because the location would be the same.
Right, so the question started out with, do we need rules on location if it's not the same machine? And I think, now how you deal with the concern, I think the concern, Tina and I were just talking about, I think the concern was, do you have, because of your administrative rules, perverse incentives for somebody to take a sledgehammer to a machine and put a new machine on the same spot because their compensation would be better, not because it was the most economic way of continuing to get those megawatts. You don't want your rules to promote that, and that may have been the concern that the commission cited for excluding one of those, repowering or
right. So
let's get to the comment that was made by the joint utilities that it's an incentive to take even though your useful life has elapsed based on the numbers. It may continue for another 5 to 10 years, but there's an incentive to take it out of service because you become eligible for a new contract.
It does relate to Tier 2. I've been told by some ADG operators that, but for the 48-month rule, they would have an incentive. It wouldn't be that expensive for them to just build new, get Tier 1 RECs compared to what they're getting in the offsets market simply because we don't allow them to be part of the maintenance tier, which is what they would rather get, is just a little bit in the maintenance tier is enough to keep their existing machines going cheaper than the Tier 1. So
although
they really are related.
Most of those are net metered, I think. The current ones, at least.
Yeah.
But I
There's a couple
also wanted to add
exceptions.
one more thing that I said to Ann. The last tech conference, we did acknowledge that this trying to sort out the who needs the payments from who doesn't is a cumbersome administrative process. And we acknowledged that if parties had proposals for, and no proposal is going to be perfect, proposals for dealing with it in a better way, the savings in administrative costs and cumbersomeness might be worth a couple of bucks going to, flowing to free riders. There's no perfect, so there's trade-offs. That
So
would be
Chris is
entertaining.
Yeah, let's go. In fact, John, I think, is next.
I'd like to go back to Peter's Florida. In that particular example, we have to recognize New York ISO has rules of interconnection. And the majority of projects that have cleared in the RPS have gone for capacity payment. The rules for interconnection on capacity payments are different. But once you have satisfied that, you can actually have that facility dormant for up to 3 years, and you still have the ability to connect back in and maintain capacity payments. 3 years of 1 day, you're starting over. You've got to go back into the whole queue process. So I do think in terms of these consistent rules, we have to recognize how New York ISO is treating assets at the location. Most astute developers, for whatever reason, if they're taking off to Florida, should recognize that there's value in that particular site. So I would recognize that we get the site into our rules here for how we handle repowering.
Thank you. Emmett.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the conundrum, and that 4 years of dormancy is sort of proof of need. And how do you establish that proof of need without the 4 years of abandonment? And I see the concern that people will repower when they don't need to repower, specifically to get Tier 1 payments. I agree with Jim that I think that's pretty unlikely in the hydro world. But I also wanted to point out, at the risk of being cheeky, that this is a problem that's created by the lack of Tier 2 support for existing renewables. You have this massive gap in compensation between Tier 1 and nothing. And, there is a temptation, I suppose. I also wanted to talk about the need to encourage maintenance. PERPA facilities were facilities that were abandoned and that were largely rebuilt. One thing I neglected to mention in my opening was that our turbines are 100 years old, but they've been rebuilt once, and they're going to need to be rebuilt again. And that would be what I would consider to be the next repower, is when we take the entire thing apart. It's all heavy iron castings, re-pour the bearings, put it back together. That's an incredibly expensive thing. It doesn't involve purchasing any new equipment. It just involves a lot of new work. So something else to consider. And that might be determined only based on like a timeline threshold of what do you feel like is the life of that kind of machinery, and you hit that timeline, and then you're eligible for a rebuild, repower.
Yeah, so in working with NYSERDA to put the repowering proposal together for the phase 1 proposal, we looked at those issues, and to tell you the truth, I was all for repowering when I was thinking about these small hydro facilities, because as Doreen and Peter can attest to, when we were looking at some of them under the maintenance tier, we were like, oh, God, they're putting so much money. Why don't they just repower the whole thing, and let's, instead of like just putting Band-Aids on these facilities to keep them going, is there some criteria? And we thought, at some point there's got to be a useful life to these facilities. And yes, it's difficult to determine, what that is for each component. Is it 50 years? You're saying they can last 100 years, so with
one rebuild.
Right. So it becomes that exercise. And what, if we were to do this, what is the right criteria? We got comments back, 20 years is too short, or 20 years is too long. It just was not consistent. And of course, that's what makes it difficult to apply the criteria if we were to go with a repowering situation. And then I just wanted to add, I can understand Chris's concern, because if you allow a repowered facility to bid into the Tier 1 rec auctions by NYSERDA, they are going to be an advantage. They don't have to put in a lot of that infrastructure, and they can bid up to the current rec price. So it is a bit of a windfall for some of those facilities who have much less expense than a new entrant that has to build all the infrastructure related to its facility. So that's what I think Chris was saying, that it's not that they're repaying, that ratepayers are paying twice. It's that the bidder is getting a windfall for things that have already on their site, and they don't have to rebuild those.
So without getting trapped in nomenclature, is an alternative, Tina, for that hypothetical facility, the owner to say, well, I've got to do this work, which is expensive, and I don't want to get hung up in the lexicon, but I'm maintaining my unit, not repowering my unit. And that then Tier 2 becomes an alternative door that addresses Chris's concern and says, well, we'll make sure there's appropriate compensation. I recognize there's all sorts of open issues that emanate from that discussion of how do you measure the compensation, what does it include, and how do you show it. But that's an avenue that's open. It isn't as if in the hypothetical of somebody having to rebuild the turbine that there's no place to go with the generator. There's no place to go.
One other
to certain facilities.
Right.
One other possibility, I guess I'd point out, if you could see down the road, and we'll see, everyone's pointed out Tier 2 is intimately related in how that ends up going to making any decisions here, it seems. Could you see a facility that wants to repower, might be eligible for Tier 2 for their baseline, assuming that'd be some reduced compensation. But if they repower and they exceed the baseline, they'd be eligible to compete for a contract for that amount. So I don't know that we need one solution,
but
there could be a combination of things.
Yeah.
That speak to a couple different concerns.
Oh, sorry. I never put this up.
That's all right.
But just one comment to that, and to respond to Scott. And so to answer Scott's previous question, yes, I think there's an avenue in the Tier 2 maintenance where, because as was structured in the RPS program, the maintenance tier or the facility could get payments up to the price of the cost of a new entrant, so whatever the Tier 1 rec was going for, but not above. So I think there is an avenue to look at a facility that doesn't necessarily have to repower, but has some pretty heavy-duty capital construction costs for maintenance or whatever. And I think we've looked at that kind of stuff in the past, rebuilding dams and things like that, where it has led to a higher maintenance award for them.
The maintenance tier does have its own issues, though, too.
Oh, it does.
Explored in the last meeting. It's not
it does,
responsive enough for that at the moment, I don't think.
Those are under Tina's scrutiny as we speak. Chris.
I wrote down so much stuff here, but useful life. I think we should be pretty thoughtful about what that is for resources. I think right now we're just focusing on a maximum of 20 years. Certainly, I think if you talk to solar folks, they'll tell you that they can go well beyond that. And I think even with some wind folks, they'll start to talk about 25 years with good maintenance. So we should, I think about those numbers carefully. So Con Edison as a regulated utility, we are 100% in favor of using materials to their useful life and beyond. And we have wires in the ground that are fully depreciated, but still, meeting their technical specifications, serving customers, and that lowers costs for everybody when we can do that. And so I'm very happy to hear about what Emmett was talking about, the 100-year-old,
You might be more
system.
concerned if those wires were all you owned.
Yeah. Right. So we have some diversity that maybe you don't in terms of age of various assets, and that's something to acknowledge. But I think we need to be careful about putting in place a program that might encourage somebody to do some non-economic things, and I think that was ultimately our concern with the repowering option. We are not against an investor getting a fair return on their incremental investments, but I think our concern is them getting a return on things that were already paid for. But I think Tina captured that pretty well. Overall, I think we should be focusing on rules that keep us going forward and making incremental progress towards the goal, and not rules that allow us a specific location to keep getting revenue, but are not the most cost-effective way to keep making incremental progress towards that overall goal. And then I felt like we started heading towards a discussion of looking at that incremental investment, and how can we come up with rules so that a developer makes an incremental investment and gets a fair return on that, and maybe a maintenance tier type structure where you're looking at the what that incremental investment is, and coming up with some reasonable return on it as a way to thread that needle.
And so, just so I'm clear, Chris, when you talk about that,
it doesn't matter if you do it after.
Jim.
I'm co-moderating. Okay, I'll put my card down.
I think two things come to mind. One is perfection is the enemy of the good. I think you're trying to fine-tune a system. I'm a systems engineer. I think
allowed to say that phrase in this room.
Oh, really? And I think some of this is making my head explode. I think you're trying to clone rate-based principles onto what's supposed to be a market-based. Now, I understand there's some subtleties here, but the reality of it is, when 50 by 30 was announced, I did some calculations. I remember sitting down to Irene and saying, well, okay, based upon 50 by 30, it's a good goal. My expectation or my projection is you need 170 new megawatts of hydro every year for 14 years, and we're 2 years into it. You're 350 megawatts behind of new.
And it's all got to be run a river.
It's all got to be around a river. So talking about whether we're repowering a 95-year-old facility, or whether someone's going to be a free rider and get some benefit, or find some loophole, is kind of silly. When the larger issue is many times more larger. And so I'm having a real tough time reconciling the reality on the ground of someone said, well, you have to build it anyway. Well, I have a 50-year federal license. I don't have to. I can abandon the license and then have the wrath of FERC on me for forever. But the reality of it is, it's almost like a binary situation. Do you want the renewables or not? At least in the hydro field. We do a license that takes 13 to 14 years to get a license. And we're kind of projecting as to what the rates are going to be out there on a market base. Okay, so when we start talking about kind of fine tuning whether someone's going to get an extra $1 a megawatt hour, when I know that $4 or $40 or $45 or $50 is $20 less than I was getting 30 years ago, it's not a question of whether someone's going to build it or not. It just can't be built. I mean, I think you're trying to fine tune this to the nth degree. It's not susceptible to that. And the reality of a specific site. I can't talk about some specific sites because we have some things before the commission, but the reality is, if you look at a specific, at least in the hydro world, very specific situation, you realize there's no windfall. There's no windfall here. It just doesn't exist. And maybe if we were talking about market base rates that were $50, $60, $70, might be a slightly different situation, but that's not going to happen for quite a while. So, I mean, the reality of it is, where are you going to get the megawatts? And Tier 2 does work into this as well. I have to acknowledge that. And we go through that equation every day. We're looking at selling Class 1s into New England, as well as maybe some Class 2s. And that weighing that back and forth. And someone said, well, do this incrementally as we go forward. Well, I would disagree with that. I would say we need clear rules. we're trying to project a business. We're business people. We're trying to project next year and 5 years and 10 years. I'm trying to project 5 years. My son is trying to project 10 or 20 years. We need some clarity because it can't just always be on the increment and just sort of, well, we'll see what happens 6 months from now. We have commitments to FERC. We have commitments to others that we have to follow through on. But I think trying to optimize it to the 3 decimal places as an engineer is just impossible in this situation. Maybe in 5 years we can look back and say, well, yeah, there were some adjustments we should have made, but the megawatts aren't being built, and they're not staying either. I mean, there are things that are being shut down.
Ann, is your flag up?
Well, I think that was very well said, actually. And I was going to address some of the points, some of the similar points. I mean, you mentioned that there's the potential for a perverse incentive that someone would take a sledgehammer to their operation before it was the economic thing to do. I should be looking here, yeah. And that is theoretically possible. But it's, first of all, there's a limited universe of generators that could do that or would ever consider it. Then you have the useful life, which is 20 years for a wind farm, 20 for solar, and 50 years for hydro. So the universe of people who could irrationally sledgehammer is that much smaller. And then you have the competitiveness factor that they're going to have to compete with other Tier 1 RECs to get those contracts from NYSERDA. And even if within that much smaller potential pool of irrational actors, there are some, it just means that NYSERDA is getting a better price for its REC than it otherwise would get because that person's competing. And the corollary or the related point is I would assume that if I was an existing renewable that was able to repower and I can bid in lower to NYSERDA, I would bid in lower to NYSERDA to increase my chances of getting that contract, not to assume that they would get a windfall. I mean, I somewhere in there, people's behavior comes into play. But I mean, I would assume if it's based on competition, then NYSERDA is getting RECs cheaper than they otherwise would, at least, or the same or less than they otherwise would.
Market rate tomorrow is $28 in this load area. RPS is maybe, 20, 22? There's no windfall. It just isn't. For the hydros that we deal with, 5, 10 megawatts, 15 megawatts, which is the vast majority of them, there's no windfall there. It just isn't. Now, could we have an exceptionally good water year and make a few dollars that year? Yes. But hydro also, remember, we have that variability of 20 or 30% plus FERC, plus the new administration at FERC.
Go ahead, Warren.
So windfall's a bad word, but what it's meant in this
waterfall.
What it's meant in this context is payment for something that we would get even without the payment. And in the flex rates analogy I use, which we've been doing for decades, it's not a sure thing. It's like a game of chicken with a large customer that's threatening to leave, and you just sometimes you do a good job. Sometimes you. My point is you don't base any decision on certainty that they will definitely leave if you don't give it. You have to weigh probabilities. You develop certain requirements of showings, but yeah. None of this is perfect. So by windfall, I don't mean that you're going to be wearing a lot of bling. I'm going to see you. You're going to like a hip hop star. Come on, I run hydro, man. But we have to do our due diligence for our ratepayers, given the context we're in. There's nothing as an economist I would rather do than set the externality price for everybody and then say, if you can't make it under that, don't come talk to us. That's That's what it's worth. And some people get windfalls underneath that because it didn't cost them that much, but that's the way market systems work. If I could just do that, but I have to worry about us losing load to more polluting fuels within the state because they're not doing it. I got to worry about us losing customers to Pennsylvania because they're always the last to do something that's clean, at least, before you get to Kentucky. But it's so in a perfect, if where we thought we were marching to in 2008 and 2009, Waxman Mark, it would have made this much less, more of a fringe problem. It's becoming much less of a fringe problem, more of a, we've got to make a choice of whether we hire more people for all the applications for righteous tier 2, or maybe we come up with a better system that's less third decimal point, more sort of we can justify as being, well, it's weeding out the worst examples, NIPA not allowed, whatever. So we're entertaining. Okay, what's a better approach? Yeah, some things will slip through the safety net, and maybe we will give a $1.20 windfall, but we're saving $5 in administrative costs. Great, give us proposals.
Yeah, I think the flex rate thing is not a good analogy. It's a bit of apples and oranges, but I understand the point, however.
Right. Well, I'm just saying where it came from, and it was the analogy used.
Yeah.
Emmett?
Can I ask Warren?
Emmett. Yep. Then Ann.
Card up. I'll put mine up too, Dave.
Yeah, I just wanted to what you're saying that we don't want to pay for anything that we would get anyway. It kind of triggers in my mind the discussion we had about sunk costs. And the problem with you have facilities that have very low input costs on a day-by-day, year-by-year basis, but have long-term capital obligations. You're sort of, by saying that, you're kind of immediately writing off any investor dollars because the facility is there, and if that particular owner were to go bankrupt and abandon it, somebody else would buy it for nothing. But that cycle is not sustainable with this technology. And the thing is, you have owners who have these facilities that have a low operating cost, and they can defer maintenance, put in their own hours, they can drive they operate, and they end up operating below their real break-even thresholds for multiple years. And you're just kind of like pushing that way further than is really sustainable or equitable with that kind of attitude.
And we have entertained under the maintenance tier projects that have come in and said, look, this can't continue. Here's the long-run investments we have to make to keep going on. And our geniuses evaluate it and say, yeah, they're right. And as long as the costs are less than new, then they get approved, but it is a one-off basis. You're exactly right. It is exactly the same thing as the sunk cost issue. And with our RMS contracts with, gas generators, we also are very consistent in arguing it should just be to-go costs. It shouldn't consider sunk costs.
Yeah.
Sometimes FERC disagrees with us, but.
So.
Then how are you going to get 300 megawatts for the last 2 years on hydro? It just isn't going to happen. The market's not going to respond to that sort of incremental. We'll see. You won't leave anyway. Nothing will be built. You'll be looking 2 years from now. It will be 600 megawatts behind on hydro, and there's only 1,200 megawatts available to be built in the first place. So again, you're trying to fine tune it. It's the angels on the head of a pin here, but the reality is it's almost binary. If you go long enough, it simply won't be there. And once it goes or leaves, it's not coming back very quickly. The hydro cycle, as I've mentioned earlier, 5 years is the minimum cycle time to get a hydro license. It's closer to 8 to 10. Okay, so that's the cycle we plan on. And so if something is turned off or we lose the right to expand something, it's gone. It's gone effectively for another 15 years.
I was going to ask, so it seems like the biggest worry at the Commission for both Tier 2 and repowering is paying for renewable energy that you don't need to. If that would be an accurate way of crystallizing your concern.
So you shouldn't quote me that that's the way the commission would put it. That was my easiest way of communicating it. I would say doing our due diligence to get the best bang for the ratepayer buck.
Okay. So
If that's the same thing, okay, fine, but that sounds better.
Right. It does sound better. So my question is, given that concern, do you feel better about this repowering proposal than the tier 2A, 2B, or 2B proposal? Because I see them as different. That with with repowering, you've mitigated that. The way you've defined it and proposed it, you've mitigated that worry, because you have the useful life and because you're competing with other tier 1 resources. In my mind, it mitigates, and I was wondering if you shared that view, that you thought it was.
So are you asking, does staff still behind its repowering proposal?
No, I guess. Well, no, I guess. No, I don't think you can answer that if that was my question. I guess I meant, do you see, if the concern is to have ratepayers pay for renewable energy that would otherwise be there anyway. So you have, do you see a difference between the repowering proposal and the tier 2A, 2B, the two things that the commissioner chose not to do, I realize.
Yeah, I'd like to think of tier 2A and 2B as a historic relic at the moment.
Okay. So how about then between the tier 2 approach that stakeholders put forward at that roundtable?
Yeah, and let me also suggest, let me see if I can phrase. I know it's going to sound a little bit different, not paying for something that's already going to be there, but not paying for something where there's been an expectation that it would be there. In other words, and this is something we discussed at the earlier roundtable, that there was a 10-year contract that was entered into, and that at the end of that period, there was an assumption, at least among some, I wasn't around here at the time, that was going to be sufficient. And after that, the facility was subject to the vagaries of the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And it turns out those vagaries are pretty extreme right now. So that there are methods through the Tier 2 maintenance program and through some of the things we're discussing today to address that. But it wasn't meant to say, I think in people's minds, that at the end of the 10-year contract, it's just time to renegotiate.
Well, I think that's completely true, that in the minds of some people, that if after 10 years it'd be done. But it's 10 years later now, and here we are.
Right.
Really? No. And so I've just heard both at that discussion, at this one, from Warren, I'll say from staff, this concern.
From Warren.
From Warren. Just Warren is the only one.
We have no idea if he's still on staff.
No, we have no idea if he speaks for staff.
That would be the main barrier to this, and from other stakeholders too, not just Warren, right? That the main barrier is to make sure that we are not having New York ratepayers pay for something that they don't need to pay for whatever reason.
So I'm giving you the economic advice. It obviously hinges on a lot of other advice. So there are also equity or fairness concerns.
Yep. But my question is, is that concern stronger with having a Tier 2 program than having this repowering proposal? Because I see them as quite different, but
well, they are different. And Tier 2A, 2B, if that's what you're referring to, is not on the table.
Yes, I know.
So,
for today.
Dividing
Tier 2 and 2A.
Well, yeah, into the old Tier 2A, 2B
I'm
proposal
trying to
we had.
get at a question of what would mitigate your concerns about that. No,
I think
A and B.
No,
No.
about
yes,
having ratepayers pay for something that they don't need to. What would solve that for you?
So
to me, it's solved by this repowering proposal, and I'm wondering
and it may be.
You think
it may be.
That is progress?
It may be. I know at least for myself, I'm approaching today to try and push and probe a little bit to really understand. I'm not advocating a position one way or the other. And there is this underlying concern that you described well, making sure, and Warren talks about due diligence, not making sure ratepayers aren't paying for something they shouldn't otherwise have to pay for. Trying to stick to the original expectation of the 10-year contract? What was the expectation, recognizing that things change, and that in light of those changed circumstances, it may be more cost-effective to provide additional revenue in the near term than to go out and get a new resource. And the Tier 2 maintenance contract, and even there we talked about different approaches within Tier 2 that could be done. This all provide different relief valves for different factual settings. So we're trying to just understand everybody's point.
So, Ann, to answer your
And
question,
then,
so I've been.
Peter,
you're
Jim.
not.
No, go ahead. Peter, Jim.
So I haven't discussed the balancing enough. We're trying to get at best bang for the ratepayer buck to get to the state's goals. With respect to things like the maintenance tier and repowering, we're trying to balance the cost saving of keeping something around for something cheaper than buying new with the cost onsets of paying for things, as I said, that we wouldn't have to pay for and still get it.
Yep.
And we realize that we're imperfect at both, and we're trying to find, and also the cost of us having to, be the judges of those things, as opposed to maybe something more programmatic that addresses the concerns, maybe less perfectly, but more elegantly, and therefore saves some other kind of costs, like administrative costs or whatever. So we're trying to balance all these things. The ultimate goal is to get to the goals we need to get to at as economically as possible, with all the other important things that just and reasonable implies.
So let me, no, I'm going to not do that. Peter.
I think we have to recognize the world's changed a little bit too. When we talk about the maintenance tier, and I was around in 2004.
You don't look it.
So this is all my fault, this whole problem. I should have done something different in the beginning, I suppose, but...
It wasn't our fault.
When the maintenance tier was put in place, it was to keep a generator running who would otherwise go out of service without some further support, and they'd have to demonstrate that, and I don't think it was easy to do. But what we weren't worried about at the end of the 10 years is there being another market, like 40 miles that way, assuming we're going to continue to, judge our performance on retail use of energy in New York State. What we have to deal with now is keeping the current generation within the state. So
See, that's a different issue.
Yeah,
I agree, but as far as like blending that with a maintenance tier sort of discussion, I think they're different concerns, and we have a more complicated world today, I think, than we've had in the past, in my experience at least.
The analogy I give, and this is not meant to be flippant, but it's the best way I have of trying to understand it, is I've been buying my bread from Neil Gold at the Price Chopper for 10 years. And he sells me bread, and at the end of 10 years, I say to Neil Gold, I've been buying bread for 10 years. I think the bread from now on is free.
No. Boo.
And Neil comes back and says, no, I just upgraded my store.
He's got all kinds of costs, whereas
he just upgraded.
Paid 99% of the cost to build something.
No,
that's what
but I don't think the numbers bear that out. Even with someone with an RPS, no, it's not that high. It really isn't.
For a windmill.
Well, I don't know the wind industry, and I don't get production tax credits. And all
so let me interject here that this I'm going to call this conversation as one that illustrates the inquiry that there may be a difference between and among technologies that we want to think about. But I do think that there's a certain expectation when those contracts were gotten into, and so let me create a hypothetical. Let's assume that there's a bona fide repowering that takes place today as a result in a hydro facility, as a result of which there's the repowering of components of the system, which is now going to last for 50 years. And that makes you eligible for a 20-year REC contract. What's your expectation at the end of the 20 years?
Good point. Well, I think you could to answer that back. What if power rates today were $80 or $90 a megawatt hour? Would we be sitting here talking today?
No, the maintenance tier might not be necessary.
Wouldn't be
But
talking.
no,
Okay.
but
What isn't the answer to the question? No one would have any idea what's going to happen in 20 years.
no. I think the lesson learned is we should have an idea. So there's a school of thought that says that the REC represents the state's acquisition of an attribute. It's a second product besides the electron. And they're entering a contract for 10 years, 20 years, 15 years to buy that attribute. At the end of the period, the attribute becomes available for sale to somebody else or to the same purchaser, and you renegotiate the contract. That's a point of view. The other point of view is the REC is the missing money necessary to build a plant. In certain kinds of plants, it pays for the plant. If the plant has a useful life beyond that time period, the ratepayers in New York have paid for it, and they're entitled to the benefit and shouldn't have to pay for the same thing twice. And if it was that clear, we wouldn't be sitting here. We'd probably all be in a different business. Frank.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was around in 2004 as well. But dealing with this issue, and I think Peter gave an accurate description of what was happening back in those days. On the Tier 1, the 10-year contract, obviously in retrospect, that was a mistake and could have gone longer. But those were the days when electric rates were still going up. We had not yet had all this dramatic drop in natural gas prices, so we were all envisioning a very different future than what reality turned out to be. The lesson we take from that is to be flexible, as I see it, going forward. And then
Number
Tier
one,
2
procurement, we thought, gee, were REC prices heading towards zero because power prices were so high?
Right. And then the Tier 2, and this is relevant, Warren, to your discussion about what I think we used to call economic development rates for some of these industries that we talked about. And in Tier 2, the reality was, yes, there was an economic dimension to it, but there was also a heavy economic development / political dimension to it, because a lot of these smaller hydro facilities were located in portions of the state where they were very important to the local economy. And they did not necessarily make economic sense from marginal cost pricing basis and a statewide basis. So just as you're dealing with the RPS and some of these other regulated issues, there are often multiple purposes you're trying to achieve beyond simply achieving the most cost-effective marginal investment. But on the repowering, Scott, I think you may have been correct when you were talking about trying to balance the what's already been paid for versus new investment, and making sure that from a ratepayer perspective we end up with the most economic investment, which basically is something that would be a new investment would have to be cheaper than an existing investment, and vice versa. It seems to me that the way of suggesting the repowering work, and I'm not getting into the eligibility, this is kind of the big picture approach, by having it go through the Tier 2 process, through the Tier 1 process, you kind of address that issue. I mean, because if a repowered existing project, so to speak, cannot compete with a new facility or a new investment under Tier 1, it's not going to get funded. So you've kind of injected in that process already these market forces that are going to provide you with some coverage and assuring that you're not paying again for something you may have already paid for.
I have a problem with this concept, and I know this has been
Which
around
concept?
for a while, of paying for something that you've already paid for, okay? So I make kilowatt hours, you buy them. At the end of 10 years, I make kilowatt hours again, you buy them. Same with environmental attributes. Why is it any different? Why is the product any different?
Well, I'll give you the hypothetical.
Yeah.
So I said there's a school of thought that says that the environmental attribute is a second product, along with the electron. The other is that the bargain is really that there's missing money in building a plant, and the REC represents missing money, and the exchange is the provision of the missing money to build the plant in exchange for the right to claim the attribute. It's not the actual value of the attribute, and what goes into a REC price, some people would argue, is much more than the value of the attribute, and it's calculated off the missing money for the plant.
I think the problem with that is that there's a contract for the RECs. We have a 10-year contract. We hammered
Understood.
out and, got beat up by Peter and Doreen on.
No, I understand.
And it doesn't say that. I mean, it's very simply, it's a contract.
No,
And
and
it said in it.
that's why I always start.
language.
Yeah, no, I understand. I understand your concept.
That's why I always start with if we had externalities priced universally, I'd agree with you. The problem is that instead, what we're deciding to do is, okay, given we don't have that, New York is going to have a quantity target. Instead of just constantly paying what this is worth, and Pennsylvania pays what it's worth, and fuel oil pays what it's worth, and gasoline pays what it's worth. Instead, we said we're going to get so many by megawatts of this thing by 2030, whatever. Quantity, not pay the right price for these RECs in perpetuity because everybody else is. We say, no, we're going to pay to what it takes to build this amount of stuff. And we know full well, we've talked to the developers all along in the RPS, where they got their pricing, how they came up with, and what their bankers said they would fund and wouldn't fund, and what they had to pay off in 10 years in order to make the bid they made.
But that's a slightly different situation. I mean, take for example, if that's correct and you're correct, then your RPS program should say, and right now, we're contracting for 20 years and we're going to own your RPS value forever.
Believe me, we thought about it.
Yes, should have. Should have, would have, could have.
Try it. You can try it. See how many
Our
people
friends
come
at the utilities say that's the benefit of going with them.
Yeah, that was the big debate. You know, as someone who,
Not a debate in 2004.
Because we never.
no, this is the debate
Put
with
this
the
way,
CES.
we got a budget which was large to begin with. You know, if we had said they're your RECs for the life of the project, I wonder what they'd be saying the life of the project is at that point. But you know, what would the bids have been? It'd be interesting to know if we could look back and see. But would our $741 million budget been, you know, $1.5 billion? I don't know, but that.
I know what the developers told us.
Yeah, I must say I must say as someone who worked under the old RPS as well as this, it was a bit of a shocker when we went to 20-year contracts and the nominal dollars came forward from a result of the bids. I mean, it's a big investment from the state. However, just to go back, we're talking about repowering. I'm trying to bring it back for you, Scott. And as someone who worked a lot on the proposal for the phase one plan, you know, I personally felt like we struck a balance. I mean, this isn't going to be perfect. It just isn't. You know, a facility that, and really for me, this comes down to the issue of useful life, which the utilities rightfully brought up, because it's probably not perfect. You know, a 20-year useful life for a wind farm, it maybe could run for 21, 22. Of course, when I think the counterpoint to all of this is when we talked about the 20-year deals under the clean energy standard, of course, many of the developers said, well, I need a longer contract. We can run much longer than that. 25 years, please. Yet when it comes to repowering,
Your price will be cheaper.
yes, because of it. But when it comes to repowering, you know, the question becomes, when is the end of the useful life? And I think that's a fluid answer, right? I mean, these wind farms that we have in New York that became operational in the early 2000s, I mean, honestly, the state of the art has changed. There's no wind developers here, but they would all say that the state of the art has changed dramatically in that time.
Also, think of the cars you've owned. You know, the useful economic life can change like that.
It absolutely can. And I think for us, or at least for me, I'll speak for myself, you know, we felt as though this struck a balance, this useful life question struck a balance between perfection, which we could never achieve, and the reality that after 20 years, a wind farm that was installed in 2003 might be a good thing to say, gosh, you know, we can now use technology that's 20 years newer on the best sites in New York State. And instead of getting a 18% or 20% capacity factor, maybe you could get 35 or 40, you know, you never know. So I wouldn't say that this, you know, was anything that we thought was exactly right. And the comments, you know, pointed out the areas where we weren't exactly right. But we were trying to control the circumstance of what is actually going to be reality in New York State. We're going to get to the point where these projects, we'll argue about it for a long time, but ultimately they will reach the end of their useful life and they will either not operate, they will repower for another reason, or New York will decide, you know, there's a policy to support them. Whatever the circumstance is, there were constraints that were placed in the implementation plan that were for a good reason, to recognize that there was, you know, a sort of a check and balance with regard to all of this. But ultimately, the goal here was to get what we equate to new resources online. that's the idea for repowering. So for me, repowering has to do about, really with regard to tier 1. It's a tier 1 issue. So we could all cogitate on that. But one other aspect I want to point out is, when we evaluate these projects, if there were a power project that were repowered that was competing against a brand new project, it actually would be at a disadvantage. Not just, obviously dollar for dollar, we would look at it that way. But remember, we evaluate against 4 different criteria. And one of them is economic impact to the state. A project that was repowered would not have the same economic impact to the extent that there weren't the same investments needed to bring it to operation, particularly on the interconnection infrastructure piece. So
Balancing things, not
yep.
on my recommendation.
But it is.
It's the rule.
It is.
Mhm.
It is.
Commission loves it.
Yep.
Well, being in the hydro 50 years, I think we'll raise you to 70 and see it and call you.
So you're ready for repowering?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, we're in
You
favor
individually.
of repowering, no doubt about it. And I think Doreen's point about the economic impact is also true for new. But the reality is, are there going to be very many brand new greenfield hydro projects? There will be a few. We have a few in the planning stage. They've been in planning for 8 years. There'll be a few of those. But the reality of it is most of your hydro expansion, at least for renewables, is going to be existing projects. And the average age is something like 80 years.
Right, but we already. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
But we already account for that. We hope that there's hydro projects out there that will, continue running, invest, put in upgrades, and they can bid that into the tier 1 auctions. So that was our intent.
Emmett?
I just wanted, I apologize, Doreen, I'm going to drag us back, but then I'll bring us forward again. I'm sympathetic to the discussion about whether ratepayers have a continuing claim on RECs from RPS projects, but I have to point out that that same logic doesn't apply to pre-RPS hydro. We were given long-term avoided cost rate contracts at the avoided cost rate calculated by the utilities. There was never any REC obligation. There was never any subsidy for the renewable power. So that discussion is moot with regard to hydro. And with regard to repowering, as far as the timeline, I do think that there are plenty of hydros who would rebuild, but again, it's the question of what's the most economically efficient thing to do. I mean, I certainly look at the lifespan of our plants, and certainly within my lifetime, there's gonna need to be a major reconstruction project. But I don't like the feeling that I have currently that I'm being sort of pushed towards a newer technology that involves more complexity, gearboxes, that makes me nervous, frankly. And I think that there needs to be some kind of recognition of the fact that new equipment is not always the best option.
Would something be more acceptable, just wondering, if we were to, let's say, get an opinion, from an engineer suggesting the extended useful life that the work that you're proposing to do would provide, as opposed to defining what components needed to be replaced and whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you could come up with some way of measuring that, I think again it's going to be a facility by facility thing. I think that would be pretty onerous to actually have an engineering report on each one.
Well,
but
that's what
the
I was
logic I'm
going to
thinking.
ask. So I'm going to jump in front of the line just to jump on your question. But so right now for maintenance tier, the process is project by project, come in and show us that you'll save us money because you're going to go out of business. But for the, here's your economic circumstances, and if you got this much more money, which is less than a tier 1 rec, it's economic for us to pay you that. So that's the current system. And I was just wondering, at the risk of being run out of the room by my colleagues that would have to review this, I mean, somebody said it's like a rate case. It's like regulated rates. It really is. If there really was a compelling case for, but you know what? If I just redid this thing and bid in the tier 1, it's much more economic than me just continuing to patch this Frankenstein project and get maintenance tier So a showing like that, what other than it could be a lot of showings. Is that a possibility?
Yeah, and before you answer, there's another variation that was discussed during our Tier 2 discussion to say that assuming there's a demonstration need, which is a threshold requirement, there could be two paths from there. One says, I'll take the social cost of carbon. And they're buying an attribute if that's the right price. And the others say, no, I'm going to need more than that. That wouldn't be enough to help me. So now I'm going to make a showing, come in and do that demonstration, and therefore possibly prove an entitlement of an amount that's greater than that. So one of the things I hope everybody takes away, that's especially those of you around the table, but anybody else who's observing, is the state and the commission in particular is very concerned about maintaining these resources. There's a seriousness of purpose about it, and that also is being compared to this role of evaluated due diligence to consider the ratepayer interests. And I know that everybody observes that. And I think that with the array of tools that we've discussed in these couple of hearings, that there's a solution that we'll have by August 22nd.
I don't know if we'll have a solution.
We'll have a
I think
proposal.
it's a report to the commission.
We'll have a proposal. We will have a report with a proposal.
Well, I would very
What's
much.
Could it be plural? Could there more than one proposal?
Absolutely.
I think the social cost of carbon is a very easy and fair metric, and it sort of makes it much more objective.
If it continues to exist.
Well, yeah, but Scott, I would have added you missed one step.
Oh,
and that
the
is,
Reggie.
Reggie, yeah, subtracted. But whether it's the Tier 1 rec payment or social cost of carbon minus Reggie, would you have a test for whether they need it or not?
I said the threshold requirement is need.
Okay.
Well,
There's a
perhaps the
threshold
maintenance tier
requirement
could be that.
I think the definition of need is simply service life, to be honest with you. Now, the other thing that I think I would avoid, I mean, NYPA as well as some utilities use this whole life extension acronym, and that can get very, very, very murky. I mean, that's the old problem of saying I have a 200-year-old house, except I replaced the roof and the front door and all the windows and the foundation. So life extension, I would just be aware of staying away from that, because that gets even murkier than.
So I may not have heard. Did you say so? Scott's proposal with the list of expected lifespan of each thing as being the criteria, and then you could get
no. What I'm saying is, in fact, there are two different. I'm trying to think of the room and the door metaphor. So there are two rooms. One room has two doors in it, and that's the Tier 2 maintenance opportunity. They say, I have a need. My current revenue isn't sufficient. I want to keep operating. I have a revenue need. And I may have that revenue need because I have to do some capital work, whatever the reason is, I have a revenue need, and I'm not being supported now. And option one is to say, thank you very much, I'll take the social cost of carbon based on some particular period of time, and then there is an exchange. You're getting my attributes, I'm getting the value of the attributes as the state now values it. That's option one. Option two in that is to say, I need more than that in order to address my maintenance needs. And I'm going to come in and show you whatever you ask reasonably for me to show you, and then I'll get more than the social cost of carbon based on however it is you measure it. That's one option. Absolutely no more than the Tier 1 rec. But now the second choice is somebody says, I'm beyond my useful life. This is much more than a maintenance issue. I'm just beyond my useful life, and I have a useful life of X number of years. I've kept this machine going for longer than that. It's time to rebuild it. And I want to be able to do that, essentially create a new asset because of what I'm doing, and now I want to go in for the Tier 1 rec, and I'll take my chances in that market. So there are two completely different paradigms. There's a third paradigm, which just says I'm going to incrementally increase my capacity, and therefore that increased capacity can be bid.
I like all of those, and I guess I'm not quite sure why they don't coexist.
They can. I'm not saying they don't.
Okay. Well, I mean, in general, as a general principle, I would much rather sell an attribute that has a market set value than be requesting a a bailout based on a financial analysis, which I know is very onerous for both Tom and Carlene, and I thank them both for their efforts on that.
They're good.
But he's saying you still would have to demonstrate financial need.
But
Right
it wouldn't
now,
be.
that's right.
But it wouldn't be tailored. It wouldn't be, as I understand it, right, like the SCC or the repower. It wouldn't be tailored to the cost of undergoing of that particular facility.
Yeah, so
That's what I heard too.
yeah, and this is comes out of the commission order, and the commission order in addressing tier 2 in the CS order said there's a threshold requirement of a demonstration need, whatever that means, and we're going to have to come up with a criteria of how do you demonstrate some level of need.
So that could be age. You're thinking.
Wait, I'm going to think nothing.
Okay.
No, seriously, right now, then they say we need to come up with a demonstration of need.
Financial showing.
It could be a financial
For
showing.
maintenance.
But the point is, it's very easy. It's straightforward. It's something that gives people confidence. It's not a detailed line-by-line analysis of revenues and expenditures. It says, okay, we can see, and there could be proxies for financial need, whatever the case may be. That's the deal. That's the maintenance tier. That's tier 2. At least that's a construct that was discussed at that technical conference. Today we're talking about something different.
I was just that the process you're explaining seems to be what was proposed in the staff white paper as tier A and tier B, 2A and 2B, which the commission.
Well, as I recall the staff white paper, 2B was resources that we just assumed would never leave.
Right, but
and that we're going to give a pittance to.
And that we couldn't leave, which is us. 'Cause
Right.
we don't have
That's
export
right.
No, this
capability.
sounds more to me like the tier we shall not name, which is if you need something, then we're going to give you the value of your clean, your emission-free generation, but not if you don't need it. Whatever that tier was, I
Well, if
believe
the
it had a
age
number.
age would be a simple.
Yeah, and A was, as I recall, existing resources that could then bid into a tier 2 that everybody would have an obligation to buy, all the ESCOs have an obligation to buy tier 2 RECs. And it is presumed that that cost will be less than a tier 1 cost. This is something different. This starts from the premise of financial need. Yet to be determined how that's demonstrated or how that's measured. And when there's financial need, we could easily, conceptually, go to saying, okay, now demonstrate, open up your books, let us measure it, and we will go through some detailed calculation and come up with what your supplemental rate will be. And we'll give you that because it'll be less than the cost of a new entry, a tier 1 rec, and
everybody gets a different price depending on their
That's right, this is their
circumstances.
circumstance.
So you have a simple.
No, that's right. He's
Well-
saying this is different from that.
and
What
then
he's going to do is
There's another option. This is the fast track. I'll call it a
Right.
fast track option. You demonstrate need, however we determine you demonstrate need, and then you say, okay, now you know that I have a need. Let's not quibble over a dollar here, a dollar there.
Right.
I'll take the social cost of carbon. Maybe in 1 year I'll make out a little better. Maybe 1 year I'm going to have to eat a little bit, but I now have a contract to deliver my attributes to you over an extended period of time that you're paying me the social cost.
5 years, 10 years,
Whatever
something like
whatever
that.
the case may be. And under that theory, again, going back to my earlier comment, at the end of that contract period, presumably, the bargain's been on those attributes. It hasn't been a missing money argument. So that's a maintenance tier concept. This is something a little bit different. This is something where somebody's saying, I need more than maintenance. I need reconstruction. It's time to retire this facility as we know it, and I'm really going to bring a new, more efficient machine, however that's done, right? And I'm going to meet the criteria that is in here, and in exchange for that, now I have the right to go after a tier 1 rec, which I've decided in my business calculation was more advantageous to me than either opening my books and getting a supplemental payment for a period of time or just showing a need in order for me to do this work and taking the social cost of carbon.
So I'll just add in, it only makes a significant difference if there's a big difference between tier 1 RECs and the social cost of carbon minus Reggie.
Right.
And that social cost of carbon, we downloaded those documents, so I don't care what he does, we got them. Go up pretty fast over time.
Yeah. Yep.
Have you, or when you were crafting the proposal for repowering, forget the question. Another option would be if you had pretty strict criteria for repowering and said, okay, if you meet these criteria, you can compete for tier 1. Based on what some people have said around the table, there might be some unique circumstances where it might be worthwhile having a process, workload notwithstanding, right? Where people could come in and say, we meet 3 out of the 5 criteria, but here's our compelling case that the proposed renovation is equivalent to the repowering contract. And I'm thinking about the dam example or something else where it would be a major rebuild of the facility, but it wouldn't meet those 5 criteria. It probably would be a very limited number of cases, but it might be worthwhile having a door like that for those types of projects.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that it's a point well taken, or we define the criteria better to get to the same result.
Yep, that's another option too.
Yeah.
And Doreen, since you mentioned wind developers, I will tell you, so we had a conversation in our work group about the criteria and the useful life, both back when we were crafting comments on it and last week. The questions are sort of like, well, what if it's economic to rebuild it at 17 years and the 10-year rec contract is gone? And I actually think there's an example in New York State now like that. I just throw that out, although, and it could go both ways. Someone would say, like, well, the project might be able to operate to 26 years, and it could be that the turbines fail at 17. The older ones, which only had 10-year contracts. For the ones that have 20-year contracts, I don't think they would ever want to repower until the contract's done, because it's like you've got a bird in hand versus one you don't have. It's not how that expression goes.
If there's a facility, if there is a renewable generation facility that has not met its useful life, and heaven forbid a storm comes through and takes it out, it's gone. What happens?
Well, under this proposal, I would assume that it wouldn't be eligible. But I sort of, 4 years. Right. I put those two together. The case where you have a major dam rebuild, where it's a very significant investment that will get a generator operating for a lot more years in New York, versus your wind turbine is gone. And so maybe for those types of what would be very unique circumstances, you would have some sort of different door appeal process or something. But I think it would be so rare that you don't necessarily.
I'm really stuck on. Hopefully, it's rare. So there are a series of wind turbines in this hypothetical that are near the shoreline, and Sandy 2 comes along and takes them out. And we've just lost that capacity. And they're gone. It seems that one interpretation would be, well, the state's just lost that for 4 years. And that seems like a strange outcome.
Or more than 4 years.
Right.
Real. Yeah. First of all, I have to say here, I know nothing about insurance of wind turbines. And that could be something that would address what you just described. I don't know.
Well, it could address it partially.
Right. But I think in that case, it might be more than 4 years, because if you allowed that to count as repowering, well, it seems
it'd have to wait 4 years, then it could qualify for return to service. So what's missing?
But then you still have to compete for the contract. It's, to me, you just have to look at logically what you would want to have happen is if you'd want it to be rebuilt and continue out the years of your contract, wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? As long as they could do it for the same rec price that you were paying.
The question is, again, it's like, what's ineligible? Is it the site? Is it the project? The project's not there anymore.
Yeah.
So is it the owner? That's what sometimes the decision seems to come down to.
Can I ask a common sense what I think is a common sense question?
Common sense.
No common sense questions.
Outside of this context, if you had a 20-year contract with somebody to provide something and this happens, and hopefully the contract anticipated, but maybe it didn't.
It's called force majeure.
Right. There's always the possibility that two reasonable parties get back together and renegotiate something that they didn't anticipate. Wouldn't we be open to something like that?
We might be, but That's the common sense answer.
I think it points.
I like
though,
the hypothetical.
It points those sort of
illustration.
trying to think outside the box a little bit, which I think is what this sort of a hypo, or, leads to us trying to do here. Which is, in other words, when you're going to say you're not eligible for another contract, what exactly is ineligible? And there have been situations that have come up along the way. We had a biomass plant put in a bid that was too low, clearly too low by 150%. They went into operation. They weren't able to do business. The site's considered now, no, you have a contract. You can't get another contract. So we just lost the opportunity to get energy out of that facility for this many years because of that one mistake that was made in the beginning.
There's a reason, there is a good side to that rule.
Right.
The good side to that rule is we didn't want people coming in and winning auctions with unrealistic projects. So that one example could discipline all the other bidders.
And also, you wouldn't want them to close down and be able
Right.
to come back and bid a higher.
What I'm
direct
saying,
price,
though, is
although-
what it highlighted was the question,
right?
What's ineligible here? Is it the owner? How about if the owner changed? After a certain number of years went by, is it because of the site? Is it because of the equipment that's on the site, et cetera?
Well, these are all things
you got to think about
that we're going
that
to have to
way, I
think about between now and August 22nd.
Unless we ask for an extension.
Scott,
No.
can I have can I ask Ann a question?
I wasn't saying no to you.
Your first circumstance, and maybe Tom, you can help me with this. Your first circumstance you described where there's a dam that needed to be replaced, which was not the prime mover, but an important component of a hydroelectric facility. Couldn't that be covered in Scott's door number 2? Door number 2 is
Number
the door.
2 is
the
maintenance
financial
tier,
Detailed
financial
Yeah.
need.
Financial
showing.
The detailed financial showing. Well, I guess I would ask Emmett if he wants to answer that question. If you
But for the fact that you need to rebuild this dam, you're not going to be able to operate anymore. So that is the financial showing. You can't afford to
tier 2.
rebuild.
Yeah.
So that's a tier 2. So that would be, that would come under tier 2 now. And we've done that.
Right.
We have done that with other. Is that the company?
That's what happened with
that's
us.
what happened
Yeah.
with you.
Yeah.
That was your facility.
How's
You
it going?
came in-
I was trying not to say it, but
Sorry.
All right.
So,
It's an interesting hypothetical. Emmett?
Well,
you received for the building of that. I don't think that's a secret. But,
No.
Well, it's
No,
not
it's not. It was a public. It was a commission order, so it's not.
Yeah, we received a maintenance tier award, which was structured to help us replace the dam, and I won't go through
Right.
all the difficulties with that. The principal one, I think, though, is that it was a depreciation-based calculation, and we had to borrow the money to do it, so we ended up with a lot less than we needed to do it.
Yeah.
And I think that if the maintenance tier actually was robust enough to provide enough revenue for a facility to really operate and to continue operating, then that would be fine. It's currently not structured that way. I mean, you couldn't. The only reason that we went down that road is because it was all we could do. The dam had failed. We were desperate to do something. And our hope now is that we can find some other source of revenue or some higher payment to actually sustain the facility.
Yeah,
but it's not.
Yeah.
You would never do that on a 20 or 50 year basis to make no money for 20 years.
Yeah, but just in fairness for the audience, that was at the Tier 2 conference. One of the issues that we discussed there was the measure of compensation. Right, and so here's what I'd like to do. Is your flag really up? Okay, I didn't think so. And Emmett's is down.
Chris is up.
I didn't quite finish, but
Yeah, so we'll do. So here's what I want to do. I want to do 2. Then I want to see if there are any questions from anybody that's in the room, any comments or questions from anybody in the room, or anybody that sent something in. And then I want to go around once, and everybody gets their closing thought. So Chris and John.
I just had a question about the discussion we were previously having about the tier 2 concept of Reggie minus social cost of carbon minus Reggie. Was it your thought that we would relook at that value on a periodic basis? Because in the tier that shall not be named, we relook at that that payment level to make sure that it's still reasonable. Okay.
Yeah, stay tuned. August 22nd.
I thought you were going to say yes, but okay.
No, you hit a good issue.
Yeah.
Just a couple of comments here, Peter. I was around in 2003, and we discussed at length the different ways to evaluate the RFPs. I advocated descending clock auction. We wanted to go with a pay-as-you-bid. Descending clock auction would have mitigated that circumstance. Going back to the two-room scenario, I see the two rooms as really, to be able to enter either room, you have to demonstrate a premise of a compelling financial need. I think there's a door number 3, and door number 3 has got the big R on it, which is repowering. And I see two sub-rooms there. I see the first one is I'm beyond my beyond the NYSERDA contract life, but less than the life of the project. And that's the one where utilities have made a strong pitch that what we think is equitable and fair is, there should be a second contract. I actually think there's some room for negotiation on that.
What's the utility's position in that situation?
We've already paid for that useful life. The NYSERDA contract is silent on the issue. Therefore, we have a flat-out issue. But it just seems like for the asset to stay in New York and to function and to contribute towards the aggressive goal, we need to work something out there. And I think something could be worked out there with the developers. In room number 3, there's a second door, and that's the one where clearly they're above the useful life. And in that case there, I think the repowering aspect comes into play. The ability to compete in the Tier 1. Doreen, there should be no disadvantage on the criteria for economic benefits. If you remember, we actually increased the economic benefits at one point in time. Why did we increase the benefits? Because we had too many external resources coming in my opinion. Then we closed the door on the external resources. My point is that for an existing viable resource in the state of New York, we should simply change the language that for a new project, it's incremental benefits. For an existing project, it's maintaining the economic benefits. But there should not be a disadvantage for that repowering project. And I think the key thing is to show the repowering project can come in at a price better than the Tier 1 project. So I like the two-room. I'm saying there's a third room, though. That's where the action is for the repowering.
I'm just constructing the house in my mind.
It's a big house.
I think it's two rooms with lots of doors. But I take your point. Anybody in the audience have any comments? Going once? Okay. Please.
Chris LaRoe from Brookfield Renewable. I'm not going to get into the Tier 2 discussion at all. Just a specific question on actually the repowering criteria from the plan. I just was seeking some of the logic or maybe some of the research that went into the 15% increase in efficiency and why that's a universal application. I don't know about some of the other technologies, but just in a conversation recently with some of my facilities guys, they say that's a high threshold for some of the older hydro, particularly because it was built, as Emmett was alluding to, it was built so well originally that you might make some economic sense to repower it. Just hitting that target might be difficult. I'm hearing something in the 8 to 10 range is more reasonable, and didn't know if there's any sort of wiggle room on that.
Yeah, that was an area that I think we expected comment on, because I agree, this is a very difficult list to apply to every single resource. And perhaps, again, it might have been better suited for wind than for another resource. So candidly, that would be an area I would have expected comment on. And to the extent that it comes up again, you should bring it up as well. But it's a good point.
So that means it could be a different number.
Right. It could.
Right.
It could. Yeah, we don't purport. Right. We don't purport to be experts on repowering considerations. But the more important point was that there was a number, and perhaps that number needs to vary by resource, but there should be a number.
Or perhaps it could be a component of a showing. Or if it's individualized, I think was suggested. There's a lot of things floated around today.
Yes.
I think, case by case repowering was suggested at one point. Maybe a case could be made that an 8% efficiency increase would make economic sense for a particular unit as opposed to a blanket percentage. So,
correct.
Okay, we have no. Just so I can get a sense, anybody else want to get in the queue?
especially their peak production. So, I mean, go from a more, towards a more run-of-river management, if they are removing and repowering. And is there any consideration for that crediting towards that percentage increase in energy?
Anyone?
I'm not. So we definitely look at those questions with regard to upgrades, but it was not part of the proposal for repowering. Trying to decide if it should have been.
I think that's kind of a good point, actually, in that, to be eligible for Tier 1, you have to be run-of-river. A lot of the facilities that might be repowering might not currently be run-of-river, and so they might have to move to run-of-river, which would mean they'll make less power.
Right. It's interesting.
You also have a lot of relicensing that it requires a lot of fish passage requirements and other inefficiencies as far as flow goes.
Yeah, I think efficiency is maybe not the right word. I mean, when you're talking about a wind tower, you're putting a bigger turbine up, which is capturing more of the wind. You're not going to capture, I mean, you could have a nameplate increase in hydro and use more of your spring flood, but you're not going to get more resource overall. So the bigger wind turbines are not more efficient, they're just capturing more resource. Bigger. Yeah.
Did you mean capacity increase? Or did you mean efficiency?
Energy.
So 15% more production on an annual basis.
Right.
So you could have 15% more production because you have a turbine with a higher capacity.
Right.
Which is...
Well,
Doesn't that answer your question? Maybe? Maybe.
Maybe. Okay. Well, thank you. Why don't we go around the table the other direction? Chris, everybody, you don't have to use your time. You can yield it to Tina. And Margaret.
Hold on. I was just ruminating for a moment. So I think this is a really important topic and something that's going to be coming up more and more as the existing wind farms kind of reach their 20-year period. I think that this issue of the facility components that are still useful and have been funded is one that's worth careful consideration. And I would suggest that maybe it would be worthwhile for NYSERDA to kind of do like a case study or something like that. And it could be hypothetical, but just, take a generic, 100 and something megawatt wind farm and at the end of 20 years of its useful life and see what still has more useful life left in it and what that facility could bid into a new Tier 1 auction and how, what kind of advantages it would get by, having those pre-existing components already paid for. That might be helpful in allaying, I think, our concern about customers paying too much for the renewable energy.
Thank you.
Just a closing thought on the suggestion of perhaps in the effort to simplify the determining the payment to the assets that would be coming in with demonstrating a financial need. I guess just a caution on assuming that social cost of carbon is the right market-based approach to it. The calculation can vary widely, and there's a lot of assumptions and discount factors, and that's comparing that to the actual financial demonstration based on actual operational costs. I think that's really demonstrating what's truly the need there. And just stepping back, renewables are meant, they should be indifferent to fuel. They should be indifferent to LBMPs because of their nature. They once their capital costs are done, they should be able to run. So that's just closing thought.
I'd like to end my comments with how I started, which is I think it's imperative that we have clear and consistent rules that we set up here. And they're set up in such a manner we're not coming back in a couple years and making changes. I think the two sides here, I represent regulated utilities, and the issue of equitable and fairness is important, but also respect the developer side. We've got to come together here and somehow understand what the issues are and resolve them if we're going to meet this aggressive goal. And I think, as I said before, I draw a distinction between someone who's under economic duress as opposed to somebody who's saying, look, I want to repower because I'm more efficient, I can make more money. And I think just laying out the criteria here for the different options, I got a maintenance tier contract option, an upgrade option, and I got a repowering option. I think it's confusing, and perhaps we can lay out, just in simple terms, a short white paper that delineates where are we right now.
August 22nd.
Okay? And then we add on to that the repowering. I'm a strong advocate, and I want to get clear, I'm not representing my company's views or my parents' company's views, perhaps even my own parents. But I think repowering is a very important component here to send the right signal, and especially for the majority of these assets which are located in New York State. And Doreen, I think it's really important that we don't have rules set up here that in any way is a disadvantage for someone trying to do repowering with the CES. And that's all I have.
Thanks again for hosting this roundtable and inviting me. There's such an intersection among all these programs. I'm really sympathetic to Warren and to Jim's perspective about how impossible it is to parse everything perfectly. I think Scott's proposal as it was laid out is not far off. I don't know that I can walk us through all of those doors, but to summarize what I think I heard, you could have
It's a fun house.
A fun house. Oh, we got slanted floors now too. But a fast track finding of financial need that would result in the social cost of carbon compensation. If you need something between that and tier 1, there's a maintenance tier, and then you could bid in as a repower to tier 1. Again, the only weakness of that is that the maintenance tier itself. If we could set that up so that it is equitable and sustainable, I mean, I've submitted comments on that, but essentially you need to have a compensation level that allows facilities to save for emergencies, to operate with diligence and not defer maintenance, and to earn a reasonable compensation for doing so. To get back to repowering, I'm only just going to throw bombs here. I think the 15% increase in output is unrealistic. I don't think the need for brand new machinery, that it has to be made after 2015 is really logical and the most efficient threshold. And I think the 80% cost basis is kind of arbitrary. I don't have a solution other than perhaps an age threshold. But thanks again.
Thank you.
I would just repeat, try to make it simple and make it as simple as possible and move on. And I'll yield to Ann on the rest.
You can wait your turn. The more I've listened to the discussion of repowering this afternoon, the more and more I find it very attractive. From the environmental community's perspective, I think it's a perspective that the Commission shares. We're looking for policies to be implemented that assure the maintenance and retention of those renewable assets that are indeed cost effective to help us achieve the overall goal. Ultimately, whether or not those assets are retained is going to be a decision that people like Jim and Emmett and others make. They're going to look at, their books and their resources and the investments they have to make. So the more options I think the Commission can provide people like Jim and Emmett and others as well to assess the viability, the economic viability and the worthiness of further investment in their projects, the better, so to speak. And I think repowering offers a pretty attractive approach for many of them. It also has the advantage of, in some ways, dealing with the concerns about us investing the state through the REC program in non-cost-effective investments in renewables, because the repowered projects are going to have to compete in the marketplace with new projects. So you allow the marketplace, so to speak, to deal with that concern. I do agree that clear and consistent rules should be the goal. That's not always attainable because we do have this habit of trying, what Jim talked about, pursuing perfection at the cost of the good. So my one suggestion would be, as the Commission puts together the program, whatever rules and regulations attached to that program, to make sure that you provide your staff as well as the NYSERDA folks with kind of the flexibility and the nimbleness to respond to changed circumstances. Because I think the one thing we can all agree is whatever the future is that we sit around the table today anticipating, that's not going to be the future down the road. So you need to have some flexibility to respond to unanticipated circumstances, to deal with some of the unique circumstances that might arise with some of these projects, so to speak. And if NYSERDA, the Commission staff, is required to go back to the Commission every time that happens and get a ruling from the Commission, then you might as well kiss that project goodbye. So as you think it through, finding some way of holding staff accountable, but at the same time providing them with the administrative flexibility they can respond to unanticipated circumstances. I remember them very well. And
Thanks. So just lastly, I guess I'm going to say a lot similar to Frank. I think repowering renewables would be good. And so in terms of the benefits to New York, you're attracting new investment to the state. You're maintaining the economic benefits in those communities where the renewables are, and they're geographically very diverse areas. You're modernizing the renewable energy generation fleet and taking advantage of rapidly changing technologies, maybe, if there is some. And you're also potentially getting some REC procurement by NYSERDA at a lower price if they compete and win. So I think it's all to the good to encourage it. I know you have to balance that with your need to ensure that you're not paying for things that the state would benefit from without compensation. But I think because of the useful life criteria and the fact that they're competing, you're mitigating that risk. And I also think that if you have clear rules, they can be different for different technologies, was one of the things that came up, and that might simplify things.
So thanks to staff for holding this today. It was very informative. I know I'm leaving with a lot more information than I came in with, which is good. I think, one important thing to consider as we await your white paper that comes out in August is really looking at balancing ratepayer interests with the state's renewable energy goals and what the best solution is for maintaining renewables across the state. I think that, is very important to the city, and we look forward to your paper in August.
Anybody on staff have some closing thoughts? Peter?
Just a couple. I mean, I agree this is an important issue, and it's going to get more important as time goes on. I'll agree again, we need very clear rules. I don't know that they have to be simple, and I don't know if they're going to be able to make them purely simple, but they should still be clear, and those are not, those can coexist. As I say, I think this is important, so I just ask everybody to put some deep thought into it. There seems like we're dealing with a few components. There are partial solutions all over the table, or at least it appears so. So it's kind of the combination of putting them together, I think, is what is going to lead us to the best solution. I don't think we're going to be perfect, but I think we can get close enough in balancing everything that we can find something that's going to make sense going forward, given our overall goals. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah. Warren has the closing remarks.
I think Peter's right. I think it's going to become more of an issue over time as we decide how we're going to continue, not just building new. It's every ton that goes into the atmosphere is an important ton. And so I have a hard time addressing the repowering issue without making some compromises, as Doreen said, to having at least some part be a safe harbor set of rules. That said, above this, we know it's not perfect, but given this safe harbor, blessed, go bid in tier 1. I don't know what the right specifics of that safe harbor are, and yeah, it eventually, ultimately, something will be deemed arbitrary, just because you know you got to have something, and you don't know it's 75, and you don't know if it's 85, but it's got to be something that's more than 50 and less. And I don't even know which thing I'm talking about, but seriously, it always comes down to that. And so the question I have, so in addition to what that safe harbor level is for repowering for tier 1, are also the relationships to, can we mitigate the problems of that by how we address tier 2 as well? Adding more technologies to tier 2, doors in houses, or whether there's an ability to not just have a showing for tier 2 payments, but also a potential for a showing of special cases. And, that's always a problem, so probably not. Special cases that get a special dispensation to go into tier 1 because it just makes economic sense. I don't know. But there definitely, in my mind, needs to be a safe harbor. And then underneath that, there are relationships to tier 2. So think about those.
Excellent. Thank you.